Hi, my name is Barry Schmidt, and I am the project director of the Neighborhood Resource Center. Over the course of the last few weeks, we've been talking about Operation Prevention, which is part of the Drug Enforcement Agency. We're going to continue on that process today. And today we're going to talk about the short and long-term effects of negative opioid misuse on the body. We're going to talk about the difference between endorphins and opioids in the body. We're going to talk about the short and long-term effects of opioids on the body. And um, part of that process, I'd like to also get any suggestions you might have for doing a social media campaign that maybe targets those things. And if we have a really good, robust piece of information, we then can put it on our Bay County Prevention Network page and say a student had completed this, giving you credit as well. Um, And then we're going to talk about what happens when to the body when somebody stops taking opioids and when they misuse it over time. So that gives you an idea of what we're doing in that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the health systems of the body. And we're going to list those health systems out there. And we're going to talk just really briefly about each of those as we move through in the process. The first one is called the circulatory system. When you think of the circulatory system, you need to think about how the heart pumps the blood back and forth. Okay? When you talk about the nervous system, we're talking about the transmission of signals to and from the different body parts. Remember the axon and the soma and that we talked about last time? That's part of the nervous system. Then we have the respiratory system. You know, that is where you take in oxygen, you breathe in with your lungs, and you get the oxygen to the parts of your body. Then we have digestive system. That's where we eat food. We digest it through our stomach and also where our intestines move. Your skeletal system is kind of your car frame, your bone structure of your body. And finally, we have the musculatory system, where that gives our body balance, strength, and movement. So those are the four body systems that we're looking at when we're looking. And what we need to do is when we're looking at opioids, we need, and misuse especially, we need to look at how it affects the circulatory system, how it affects the nervous system, how it affects the respiratory system, the digestive, skeletal, muscle systems. We need to keep that in mind when we're taking a look and seeing what that actually does to the body systems. Now that we've done that, we need to take in consideration and examine the short-term effects of opioid use on these systems. I want you to consider ways that an endorphin rush from opioid misuse affects each body system. Think about this, and I'm not going to ask you to answer it on a paper or anything, but just think about this. What effects appear during or immediately after? What effects might appear years later? Okay? So as you think about that, we're thinking about short term, we're thinking about seconds, minutes, hours, days, and when we're talking long term, we're talking weeks, months, and years. Now, I'm going to show you a list of short term effects of opioid use. They're on the screen, and what I'd like you to do is either on a piece of paper, or I believe that your teacher can create just a quick document here. Looking at those systems we talked about earlier, let's get back to this again, the circulatory, the nervous system, the respiratory, and the digestive and skeletal muscle. Where would you put each of those effects of a short-term opioid use at? So I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and I'm going to go ahead and give you some time to do that. Now, I gave you some time to come up with what systems affect the opioid use in the short term. If you need more time, just go ahead and pause the video. But I like to give you the answers. So when we're looking at euphoria, that's your nervous system. You know, that's an important part. The slowed heart function, that's your circulatory system. Your slowed breathing, that's the respiratory system. Your dry mouth, nausea, and vomiting, that's your digestive system. The warm flushing of the skin, that's your muscular system, and as well as your heavy feeling in your fingers and your toes. And the bone thinning, that is from your skeletal system. So understanding that opioids can slow breathing by altering the brain stem, which controls. So in the back of your head, so if you turn around and you look at the back of your head here, that's called your brain stem. Your brain stem is like a car with cruise control. If you've been in the car with your family when you've been driving on the highway, they can hit a couple buttons and all of a sudden they take their foot off the gas and the car will keep going. Well, that's exactly what the brainstem is. It's an automatic piece of your brain that basically does things without even thinking. So breathing, all those things. If we had to think about it, we probably wouldn't be alive. But because of that back of your brainstem there, it has an automatic piece that continues moving forward. The thing about opioids is they also can affect the pleasure principle, which basically means they get a rush of that dopamine we talked about in the endorphins and opens that keys we talked about last time. Remember, the limbic system is the one. So the limbic system, when we're talking about automatic, that's your brainstem. When you're talking about the limbic system, that is talking about pleasure, okay? That's also called your pleasure principle in there. Then your spinal cord, that's where the messages are transmitted within that system to the body in different sections of the body. So, as we said, the brainstem is automatic here. The limbic system is your pleasure principle, and your spinal cord is the one that basically brings everything to the point where it's getting those messages. Okay, now that we talked about the short-term effects, let's talk about the long-term effects. I want you to answer this question, not on paper, just in your head. What effects occur over the long term? Remember, that's the months, years that actually do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you once again, let me give you those. See, these are long-term effects of opioid use. So what I'd like you to do is, what systems do these fit into? Remember, the systems would be, as an example, the circulatory, the nervous system, the respiratory, the digestive, the skeletal, muscular. So if you haven't written those down yet, I'll give you a minute to do that real quick. Once again, remember, you can always pause the video to write those down and make sure you have those. Okay, the circulatory, the nervous system, the respiratory, the digestive, the skeletal, and the muscular. So let's go ahead and move forward, and let's talk about the long-term effects. So I'd like you to look at those long-term effects that are listed under tolerance, physical dependency, abscess, pneumonia, decreased liver function, infection of the heart, collapsed veins. I want you to know what systems do those all end up coming from. So once again, as I said, I'll give you a minute. And then if you don't have that done, don't worry, you can always pause the video and write that in. I will ask your teacher to just, once again, help you figure out those long-term things are as well, and put that into probably a Google form or Google Doc like you did last time. I'll ask her to do that, or he do that. So most important thing to understand when we're looking at this is that a long-term effect is physical dependence. And once a person becomes physically dependent on opioids, they require larger amounts of the drug tolerance and suffer from withdrawal. And we'll define that as we move forward in that process. They also risk becoming addicted, which means that it becomes a compulsion or their primary purpose in their life. And it greatly explains the risk of experiencing a long-term effect. So let's see what systems these are in. When you're looking at tolerance and physical dependency, that is in your nervous system, okay? When you're looking at abscess, we're looking at the integumentary system. That's a new one we didn't talk about, but the integumentary system. When you're looking at pneumonia, that's your respiratory system. Remember, that's where you breathe from. When you're looking at your decreased liver function, that is from the digestive system. Infection of the heart is from your circulatory system. And then your collapsed veins is from the circulatory system. So how well did you do? Okay. So as we move forward, now we've talked about the long-term and the short-term. So now that we talk about the long-term and short-term effects of the opioid misuse, let's go into understanding the overall effects of opioids on the body. And we'll compare some short and long-term things. So to help you understand this, I want you to imagine how a person would feel if they experienced those endorphin rushes every single day, multiple times a day. What would happen the way they feel? Now, if you're not really understanding this, think about it this way. Have you ever eaten spicy things, foods, back to back? Does the food taste less spicy over time? So this is what we're talking when we're looking at tolerance. Tolerance is the need to take in larger and larger amounts to get the effect that somebody wants. So let's look at this short-term and long-term effects. When looking at the short-term effects, coma, that's where they may go into a deep sleep and they may not be able to function and do the things they need to do, but they can come out of it. Drowsiness, they get really tired. Euphoria, they get that feeling, that out-of-body experience that they want, not with reality. In unconsciousness, where basically you can do anything you want to them, and you might not even know. That happens a lot of times in an opioid overdose. People end up having that. You can, rub their chest, you can pull their hair, whatever it is. Unconscious, they're not going to feel any of those things. Some long-term effects, however, when we're looking at the effects on the nervous system, is that insomnia. Anybody ever had trouble sleeping? Exactly. Well, that might be brought on with when you're looking at opioids, misuse, muscle and bone pain, physical dependence. The physical dependence, once again, remember, is not addiction, but it's the body's result of saying, hey, I need this. They might become restless, or they're kind of like all over the place. And in the nervous system, the tolerance continues to build. And as you continue building tolerance, it makes it more difficult for physical dependency to be stopped and addiction to occur is more likely. So as that tolerance continues, tolerance keeps building. Well, guess what happens? Overdose. The body gets too much and it says, I'm shutting down. I'm not doing anything. I don't want any more. Okay, so an overdose can occur. So this is why understanding the long-term and short-term effects are important, because we can make healthy choices for our body. We can understand how opioids affect our body, and we can help make those good decisions. Information will help us think carefully about it when we use opioids for medical reasons. Opioids, or what we call opiates, have some long-lasting effects and impacts on the body that aren't healthy. So I want you to understand the importance of knowledge and using the information to make good decisions. All right. So now I want to kind of go on a virtual field trip. This is a short video where we're going to examine specific problems caused by opioid misuse. So I'm going to stop sharing this at the moment. And then I'm going to show you a video. And that video, as I said, is going to be called Virtual Field Trip. And in that virtual field trip, we'll give you the full screen here, you're going to learn about some stories about individuals that have actually dealt with these issues. And I'm going to stop sharing my video so you all can see just the video. And as part of that process, I'm also going to make sure that you understand we're going to talk about some questions afterwards. We're going to talk about how you define someone who's physically dependent on opioids. What behaviors suggest it? Why do individuals misusing opioids steal? What challenges does physical dependency prevent from opioid misusers and their families? So we're going to talk about those questions afterwards and actually have you answer those. So keep an eye on this video. Like I said, this video is 30 minutes long. If you'd like to pause it in between, you can to get a break. But remember, this is part of the whole lesson. So I'm going to get you started.
Do you dream of being a pro athlete or a famous musician? Maybe you dream of starting your own business or being the researcher who finds the cure for cancer. You all probably have thousands of dreams of what you want to be or do or see. But I'll bet that none of you, not a single one of you, dreams of becoming addicted to drugs. And yet, all across America, student dreams, just like yours, are being derailed by opioids. It often starts innocently. A prescription from a doctor to manage pain so you can play in a game. A friend offers a pill that can help you study for a big exam or play your instrument better for your next rehearsal. But no matter how it starts, once addicted, it's not easy to end. Today, we're going to meet real people who will share the truth about opioids and the science behind addiction.
I've been sober for 4 years.
I think I've definitely abused painkillers and anti-inflammatories at some point.
We'll uncover facts about addiction and their personal experiences to give you the information you need to make smart choices and stay on the path to realizing your dreams. These are powerful stories, believe me. Throughout the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can submit your questions, comments, even pictures by tweeting them to hashtag Operation Prevention VFT. Our first story is one that spans 3 generations and is still unfolding. Let's take a look.
My name is Donna Connell, and opioids have affected my family, basically caused devastation in my whole family. I had 2 sons, twin sons, who were heroin addicts, and I lost one of my sons 4 years ago to an overdose. My twin sons were born into what I consider to be an average family. They were inseparable, and whatever Jordan did, Justin did. They were Boy Scouts, very athletic. Anything that involved a ball, they played until they began to use. They lost interest in sports. At that point, they started to have issues in school. Childhood friends they'd had since kindergarten, those friends all went away. Shortly after that, I started having things missing in my home, jewelry, anything that was pawnable started leaving the house. I got to where I couldn't trust them. My father was an alcoholic. Their father was an alcoholic. I believe that addiction is a disease. I think it's genetic. And I believe it's something that lays dormant in you until you click that switch on the first time you use and you feel that high. And I think that's what happened with them. Their father went into a rehab, and several months after that we separated and divorced. I had to work 2 jobs to support raising them, so I wasn't home a lot, and I think that was kind of a turning point also. After Jordan died, Justin told me that there was no way they were ever, either one of them, going to be sober as long as the other one was alive. The turning point for me really was at Jordan's visitation at the funeral home. And I was standing over his casket, crying, and Justin walked up and hugged me and said, "Mom, I'm done. I don't want to put you through this anymore. I'm done with drugs." 20 minutes later, he walked out of the front door of the funeral home and shot heroin up in the parking lot. And I knew at that point that if death, his brother's death, was not a deterrent, then there was nothing I could do to stop him. Justin has 2 beautiful babies. He gave me 2 beautiful grandkids, Zeta and Zane. They basically haven't known their father. Over the past 3 years, he's been in jail or treatment.
You talk to your dad sometimes on the phone. What do you guys talk about?
Why he's there and to make my mom feel better, not to end up how he is, and he wishes that he can be here playing baseball and stuff like that.
Do you get mad at him sometimes?
Yeah, because I don't want him to be here. He should be here instead of in jail.
What would you say to other kids?
Stay away from drugs because they're a horrible thing to do, and you'll end up in jail or prison, and when you could be spending time with your family instead of being there.
We've been pretty honest with him about where their dad is and why he's there. I've made it very clear to Zane especially that this is a disease and that he needs to be aware that it is a disease in our families. It's passed along. Shortly after Jordan died, I made a commitment to him to be his voice, bring awareness to the disease. I don't want people to live in the dark about it. They need to know the cold hard facts because it can be life-saving. It can be life-saving.
We are lucky to be joined now by Katie Drew, a Senior Prevention Program Manager for the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA. Katie, thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
So what struck me most about Donna's family's powerful story was how much the person with addiction also affects parents and children and really the whole community at large. It's not just one person struggling against addiction.
That's one of the devastating things about addiction. Not only does it affect the person who becomes addicted to drugs, it also affects their entire family and maybe even their community. In 2017, there are about 134 opioid overdose deaths per day.
Every day.
Every day.
Well, another thing that stood out from Donna's family story was the fact that a family history can actually be an indicator of whether a person is prone to addiction. Is that right?
Research does suggest that if there is a family history of addiction, then a person has a higher risk of becoming addicted themselves.
Wow. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask you some of the questions we're getting in from students.
Sure.
And don't forget, we really do want to hear from you. All you have to do is tweet to hashtag Operation Prevention VFT. So here's what we've gotten so far. What makes opioids so addictive?
Actually, that's a great question. It all begins with the brain reward system. Deep within the brain is a set of structures called the limbic system. The limbic system contains the brain's reward circuit or pathway. The reward circuit links together a number of brain structures that control and regulate our ability to feel pleasure. Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors. When the reward circuit is activated, each individual cell in the circuit relays electrical and chemical signals. The small gap between the sending and receiving cells is called the synapse. In the reward circuit, dopamine neurons release the neurotransmitter dopamine. The released dopamine molecules travel across the synapse and link up with proteins called dopamine receptors on the surface of the receiving cell. When dopamine binds to the exterior of the dopamine receptor, this causes proteins attached to the interior part of the receptors to carry the signal onward within the cell. Some dopamine molecules re-enter the sending cell via dopamine transporters and can be re-released. When a reward is encountered, the presynaptic cell releases a larger amount of dopamine in a sudden burst. Dopamine transporters will then quickly remove the excess. Dopamine surges in response to natural rewards help the brain learn and adapt to a complex world. However, drugs are able to hijack this process, contributing to unhealthy behaviors and consequences. So what happens is drugs hijack the brain reward system. What they do is they mimic the body's natural neurotransmitters or endorphins and take their place. And when they do that, it sends a different kind of message, an abnormal chemical message than is normally sent. When somebody takes opioids, it causes the brain to push out more dopamine. And what that does is cause more dopamine to bind to more receptors. And it gives the person a more pleasurable feeling. And because this is what the brain is supposed to do, that actually hijacks that system, and that makes the person want to take more drugs. It's kind of like when we have our natural neurotransmitters giving us a natural reward, it's like somebody's whispering in your ear. But then when you take opioids and you're using an external opioid source to give you that drug high, that drug reward, it's like somebody shouting into a microphone. So our brain is, so if we were listening to the radio, for example, and it was too loud, we would turn down the volume. And our brain does the same thing. It realizes it's putting out too much dopamine, and it turns down the volume or scales back on the amount of dopamine it pushes out. And that makes the person then want to take more to feel normal, and that's the beginning of addiction.
Wow, that is a very tough cycle then to break. Does everyone who takes a drug get addicted?
Well, not necessarily, because everybody's body is different. When we first take the drug, our bodies feel this really immense high. Now that our brain is hijacked, it wants us to keep taking that drug. So we take more of that drug so we can try and feel that high again. And we actually never do feel that high.
It's down here.
That's
and then
called
down
chasing
here.
and dragging. You need to take more and more and more of that. When we eat, we get that same little jolt of pleasure. And when we fall in love, we get that same little jolt of pleasure. These are natural neurotransmitters. Our brain ends up relying on the drugs that we take rather than our natural neurotransmitters and puts everything out of balance.
I think what you've just said is there's science that says this is what happens and this is why addiction is such a terrible thing. It's a science thing. It's not a willpower thing, right?
It's definitely science-based.
Why do so many people misuse opioids?
Sometimes people will use a drug because they have a family history of it, and they may be predisposed to become addicted to drugs. Some people use drugs because they've had a traumatic event happen in their lives. There might be an emotional event. Athletes, they may get hurt while they're playing, they get injured and they get prescribed a drug, and then that ends up sometimes leading into addiction. So there's a variety of reasons why people take drugs.
That's a great segue, Katie, because our next story is with two elite athletes, former NFL players who understand the culture of playing through pain and the consequences of using opioids to manage pain from injuries. Let's hear from Lyle and Levi now.
My name's Levi Brown. I spent 7 years in the NFL. I played for the Cardinals and then finished up with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Being an offensive lineman is rough. Every single play, offensive lineman is making contact with someone. People getting stepped on, people falling in the back of your legs. It's gruesome down there.
My name's Lyle Senline, and I played in the NFL for the Arizona Cardinals. I always put pressure on myself to play and always try to continue to play at a high level. As I got older, it took longer to recover. I was trying to be tough. I was doing whatever I could to stay on the field. If I wasn't on the field, maybe somebody else behind me could do the same job.
The pressures of football and athletics in general cause you to get into a mindset where you have to do certain things because you don't know if someone's going to come in and take your job.
I always felt like I was always in some sort of discomfort or pain. Most of the time since high school, my father played in the NFL as well, so I knew I always wanted to get to that level. I always put pressure on myself to be tough and to always be out there.
As far as pain management, I think I've definitely abused painkillers and anti-inflammatories at some point. Before games, I would take a cocktail of pills. I would take them on the night before the game so that I wouldn't wake up in pain in the morning.
After surgeries, yes, there's a lot of pain. Opiates, a lot of times, are necessary for a few days. I would always try to get off the opiates as soon as possible. I know myself, I'm pretty addictive. I made the decision to not go down that path.
It's important that you know your own body and you know that there are risks involved if you decide to take something like an opioid. Painkillers and opioids, they don't fix the problem that you have. They simply mask the pain. You're actually hurting your body and hurting yourself in the long run.
Educate yourself on how to handle pain. There's plenty of alternatives out there, and that's what I'm trying to do now, is help people learn about alternatives to dealing with pain. P2M2, we're professional players, medical missions. We're an organization that's trying to educate, going to schools, talking to kids at practice, before, after practice, about dealing with pain and a safe way to stay on the field or a safe way to get back on the field quicker.
I think the one thing that students should know about opioids is not to have the misconception that those who have become addicted are lowlifes. I'm not like them. This can't happen to me. When they don't realize that that heroin is an opioid, and those same ones that the doctor prescribes have the same addictive properties. Most of the time, those People who ended up there were highly educated. They became addicted after having an injury or something. They just need to realize that, this can happen to anyone, and you need to be careful when you're dealing with these type of pills.
Well, that was really something. I've never been in the NFL other than going to games and watching a bunch of them on TV, but I do know this, and it's easy to understand how the pressure to play through pain must be enormous. It's fantastic to hear that Lyle and Levi are trying to help young athletes see the potential risk in taking opioids and learn about alternative ways to manage pain.
When somebody is prescribed an opioid for pain, what people don't understand is they need to kind of wean themselves off of that within like a day or two and try some other types of pain relievers, because the problem is if they don't do that, they can become addicted. When you take a prescription drug, you think, well, this is a drug that was prescribed by a doctor, so it's got to be safe, right? I'm not going to get addicted. The problem is that prescription opioids are just as dangerous as street drugs if they're not taken correctly. It's something that you really have to follow doctor's orders when you do take those prescription drugs.
What percentage of heroin users got hooked on pain medications before they moved to heroin?
Actually, according to NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, about 80% of people who are addicted to heroin started with prescription opioid drugs for chronic pain.
The people who have prescriptions, what percentage of those people start abusing opioids?
About 21 to 29% of people who were prescribed prescription opioid drugs for chronic pain ended up becoming addicted.
Well, that's almost a third. Is any opioid safer than other opioids? Are there safer ways to manage pain?
There are a lot of ways to manage pain, and again, that's something that you really need to, somebody who is taking these needs to really work with their doctor. Your doctor can assess you, assess your medical history, your mental history, your family history, and decide what type of pain reliever you need. Now, a lot of times people can use alternative methods of pain relief, like yoga or meditation or acupuncture. But for really severe chronic pain, like for somebody who has cancer, you may need an opioid. But then again, it's your doctor that you really have to work with to make that happen and know what needs to be done.
So be careful, talk to your doctor. So we've been talking about physical pain, but our next story illustrates how people sometimes misuse prescription drugs to help deal with trauma or a loss in their lives. Let's hear Angie's story now.
My name's Angie Long, and I'm here to tell you my story about alcohol and drug abuse. While I was growing up, my mom was really sick. She suffered from breast cancer, and my dad, to work, had to live in another state. I didn't know if my mom was going to make it. My mom had 7 surgeries in 3 years. I have a little brother that's 4.5 years younger than me. I had to basically be his babysitter all the time. I felt a lot of pressure on my shoulders just to take care of me and my brother. I struggled with it, just internalized it all. I also struggled with my dad. I always had this need for trying to achieve self-worth. I didn't feel a lot of love in my house growing up. I did have 2 parents, but I didn't feel that way. I just wanted to feel loved. And then I got to high school and I met the love of my life, I thought, but it was my first love, and you never forget those. He was amazing and cared for me like I always wanted to be cared for. We drank and we did what I thought was high school things. And he ended up getting into a car accident, a drug and alcohol related accident. He killed himself and a friend. And my life fell apart that day, that moment. I was 19 years old. I had never lost anybody significantly. I had never not been able to see somebody again. I didn't know what pain and grief like that felt like. And from there, I drank and realized that I didn't have to feel if I kept drinking. I met somebody that I married. We pretty much drank every day. We associated with people that did the same thing that we did. I didn't know any different. I would pop pills and keep drinking from there. And my pain pill addiction carried on. I have a chronic pain issue that a lot of girls suffer from. I have endometriosis. It's extremely painful for me. So I'm prescribed prescription pain pills for that. So it was a miracle the day that I had my little boy and I got to look at him for the first time. I had postpartum depression, so I got prescribed medicine for that. And I felt like people were pushing more pills at me as a solution to my problems. I struggled so much with feeling guilty, with depression, with anxiety. I was on a downward spiral and I couldn't see it. But it got to a point where I was drinking and taking more pills and passing out. One day, my family showed up in my living room. They had a counselor there, basically gave me the option to go to treatment or she was going to turn me into Child Protective Services. I went to treatment and got help. Sobriety has given me a new life. I've been sober for 4 years. Started playing softball when I got sober. A couple months after I got out of treatment, and I continue to play softball. Learning how to have fun sober is really important. My family intervening in my life and sending me to treatment was the best thing that ever happened to me. I thank them as much as I can and as often as I can for that second chance, because they loved me enough to know that I deserved better, that I didn't have to live a life controlled by my addiction.
I love the way that Angie started playing softball again to bring fun back into her life. How important is that for people who are going through recovery for an opioid addiction?
Actually, that's really important because one of the things when you misuse drugs, it actually changes your brain chemistry. So the things that used to feel fun to you, like hanging out with friends or you're eating some food, the things that our natural neurotransmitters would do to us to make us feel pleasure, that doesn't feel fun anymore. It no longer gives us pleasure to do those things. All you want to do is get high. So once you get into recovery, your brain kind of has to relearn how to have fun again. You need to go out and do these kind of things that you used to do to kind of retrain your brain.
This has come in from more than one person. Are some people more susceptible to misusing prescription drugs than other people?
If you have a family history of addiction, you can be more vulnerable to addiction. If you're dealing with trauma or an emotional issue or perhaps had a sports injury, those are all ways that people can become addicted or are more susceptible to addiction. But one important thing that I want to mention, and this is especially true for students, teens and young adults, and this is roughly between the ages of 13 and 21, 22, maybe older, their brain is actually still developing. Brains don't finish developing until sometimes to late 20s. And so during that crucial time of brain development, a lot of stuff happens. And this is the prefrontal cortex, which is the area in the front. And this particular area deals with assessing situations, making decisions, learning how to control desires and wants. When someone's a child, they have to listen to their parents. The parents tell them what to do. But as they break out into adolescence, into becoming a teenager and older, they have to start making these decisions themselves. And the brain is set to do that. Now, when you put drugs, and opioids in particular, into that mix, they can actually change the brain chemistry during that crucial development. And if that happens while the brain is developing, then it could make permanent changes. And so your brain would never develop the way that it's supposed to develop.
So when you need your brain the most, that's when opioids can do the most damage.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, that's something. And our next story shows how incredibly difficult it can be to recover from addiction and stay sober, especially when that addiction starts at a young age. Let's hear from Carl.
My name is Carl Schmidt. I'm a recovering person and a violinist. I started violin at 3 years old, began to go into New York City and play semi-professionally by 10. At 13, I made my Carnegie Hall debut with the New York Youth Symphony as the principal violinist. I guess I was 15 years old. My friends took me to a concert and I took drugs for the first time. Came home and I just remember telling my parents, I think I'm done with this classical thing. I'm going to go play rock and roll and tour. I went to music school on a full music scholarship in upstate New York. After 2 years, I had already drank myself nearly out of college. I was introduced to cocaine, and within 6 months, I was pretty much an around-the-clock cocaine user. I moved to Miami Beach, Florida, where I Took an opiate for the first time. I was fairly convinced I would be addicted to it. I became homeless and stealing from parking meters to support my habit. And I got put in jail for breaking into parking meters. And it was at that point that I called my parents finally and I said, I think I probably have a drug problem. I went to my first treatment in late 1999, early 2000. I would get out of treatment. I would, do sober living for a little bit. I'd put the band back together. I'd get into a relationship and things would look good from the outside. And then I would just self-destruct and run back into treatment again. I've been to 17 residential treatment centers. I just never had a life worth staying sober for. When I got out of treatment, I think I had two weeks sober, and my recovery sponsor suggested that I take my violin up to a senior home and play for the residents. It was incredible. And they were so grateful that somebody had taken time out of their day to go play for them. And I didn't feel like using it. It just clicked that day that this is what I need to be doing. There are definitely things I regret. If I had to go back and never try an opiate again, I definitely would not. Opiates over the years have decimated my relationships with my family and my friends. If you're going to use heroin or if you're going to use opiates, it's a life-altering decision. I mean, you may as well give away your money, give away your family, give away your friends, because I don't know anybody who recreationally gets into opiates, not a one. Withdrawal is terrifying. It's awful. Every cell in your body cries out for the drug, writhing in agony, throwing up. There's no pain like getting off opiates. When I wake up in the morning, I'm relieved. I'm not sick. I'm not looking for a fix to get out of bed. And I go and I play these events for these folks, and I'm filled with compassion and gratitude and love and awareness, and I don't feel like using. We also work with a number of special needs facilities in the Austin area. I feel very fortunate to do this work. You walk in and you get these incredible hugs from these special kids, and I just realized that my problems are very, very insignificant in the greater scheme of things. When I realize I have no reason to go get high today, my problems are not that bad, then I feel gratitude.
Wow, rehab almost 20 times before it worked? That's a lot of time and a lot of money spent trying to get well.
Yeah, and with opioids, it's not just the stopping, it's actually the staying clean. Now, one of the things about when somebody becomes addicted to drugs, once they go through recovery, and let's say they go through recovery, they've managed to go through all the terrible withdrawal symptoms, and their brain now starts acting normally again, is starting to put out the regular dopamines, the regular neurotransmitters, and they start to feel normal. And they can be clean and sober for 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. But what they don't realize is that the memory of how that felt and the craving that they had for that drug is still locked away in their brain, in an area called the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus. So they're doing fine, and all of a sudden something will happen to trigger that memory. But whatever it is, just seeing that will trigger that memory, and that memory will come flooding back just as strong as it was 20 years ago. And that craving that they felt comes back just as strong. And that's why it's so hard for people to stay in recovery sometimes. And that's why addiction is so terrible.
If you look at the people in the long list of celebrities who really had everything, you'd think that they'd be able to escape this, but they don't. They've overdosed, they've died from their addiction, and we're talking about people like Michael Jackson, Prince, Amy Winehouse, Whitney Houston. They have access to a lot of different kinds of treatment, and it didn't work for them. So sometimes treatment is just not enough. How long does the recovery process for heroin usually take for people once they get addicted to heroin?
It's a lifetime. No, really, it is actually a lifetime, because once your brain chemistry is changed, it doesn't change back. And that's why the prevention message is so crucial. For people who have become addicted and gone into recovery, there's about a 40 to 60% chance that they're going to relapse again. And that's been shown. So the best thing is to not do them in the first place, and then you don't have that issue.
Katie, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else you'd like to say, finally, to students that are watching us?
Well, the main thing I want to get through to students this age is that During this time of their life, their brain is going through an incredible amount of change. It's growing, it's developing, and anything that they do that interferes with that change can make permanent changes in their life. And so misusing drugs can have a lifetime effect on them.
Is there any other research that's happened right now that we should know about?
Actually, there has been some recent research by the University of California, San Francisco, and they did some research on why opioids actually tend to give people a higher feeling of pleasure than our natural neurotransmitters. The molecules that we are looking at right now are morphine and heroin. These are two of the external opioids that people would use. Now, what the researchers have discovered was that these external opioids, when they are taken by people, they actually act a slightly different way than our natural neurotransmitters. Not only do they send different chemical messages and push out more dopamine, which gives us more intense pleasure, they also can actually go into the cell a way that our natural neurotransmitters can't. They can activate them more quickly. So not only are you being flooded with more dopamine, it's also happening faster, and that's a major cause of addiction.
We've given you a lot of information, and we hope you've learned from it. Katie, thanks for sharing with us the science behind addiction and recovery.
You're very welcome.
And really, we want to thank all our guests for sharing their stories and allowing us to learn the facts about opioids through your personal experiences. And thanks to all of you for joining us today to hear these important stories. For young people watching, maybe the message is this: you have strong brains. Don't let something that might be stronger get inside. This show will be available on demand on OperationPrevention.com, so please share it with everyone you know. If you want to continue exploring this topic, you can access free classroom resources like digital lesson plans and self-paced modules.
So let's move forward now. Now that we've actually seen the video, let's ask some follow-up questions to this. Let's get to the right slide here. First of all, really quick. Apologize for schedule here a little bit. All right, so now that we watched that, I'm going to ask you to answer these questions. And you can answer these in a short Google Doc thing. Number one, how would you define someone who is physically dependent? How would you define someone who's physically dependent? What behaviors would you see if someone's misusing opioids? So how would you find someone physically dependent, and what behaviors would you see to show that they're misusing opioids? Question two, how might individuals, or why might individuals that are misusing opioids steal? Explain why that would happen. And third, what challenges does physical dependency present for opioid misuse in their families? Once again, those questions are on the video, and you can at any time pause the video to make sure that you're getting those questions. So what I'd like you to do is answer those questions in the Google Doc that will be created for you, that you'll be able to use as an assignment piece. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward then. Let's talk about physical dependency. Physical dependency happens when somebody stops using an opioid. So imagine you're doing a routine like brushing your teeth every morning, and you just stop abruptly. Guess what? Your body would know what's going on, and it would get something called withdrawal. Withdrawal is when your body gets some physical signs letting it know that that is happening, and that's part of the physical dependency. So let's see if we can get this to the next slide here. Withdrawal occurs if drug use is reduced abruptly after physical dependence. So let's talk about some symptoms of that. Symptoms might include sweating, dilated pupils, vomiting, fast heart rate, maybe some goosebumps, abdominal cramps, your body is telling you, involuntary leg movement, that there's something going on, that something's been taken away. Think about this. What's your most favorite food you like? What if you were told you never ever could have that again? Okay? Now we're leading into the world of addiction. But withdrawal can happen with the physical dependency because it's something that the body's been used to has now been taken away. So now if you think of any other questions you have about opioids, you can also put those in that Google Doc as well. That way we can share more information with you. So let's wrap things up for today. We all have different ways to release good endorphins, and we can proactively plan for stressful times that can help us make healthy choices for handling them. So how can we avoid opioid misuse? That will be what we'll be talking about now. I should say next time. So withdrawal is what we're talking about in the process. So let's do a quick check here to make sure everybody's got it. So our objectives today were to, number one, help talk about the short and long-term effects of opioid misuse in the body. Number two, show how endorphins and opioids affect the body. Number three, demonstrate the nervous system and understand those different systems we have. 4, explain what happens when misuse of opioids happens over time. And then 5, what happens when suddenly you stop taking in opioids. And what we've asked you to do today is to think about how those different circulatory, digestive, nervous, respiratory, skeletal, and muscular systems are affected by the opioids. And we ask you to do that in the short term to figure out, based upon that list we gave you before here. We'll go back to that real quick here. Oh, there we go, to that. Which system it fits into. We're asking you to do that for your Google Doc. And we're asking you to do the same thing for the long-term effect as well. Figure out what systems those are in there. And then finally, we're asking you to answer some questions based upon the video that we watched, the virtual field trip. We're looking at how you define someone who is physically dependent, what behaviors might suggest there's an issue, number 2, why do individuals that are misusing opioids steal? And finally, what challenges does physical dependency prevent for opioid misusers and their families? So with that said, and looking at the withdrawal at the end here, that is all today for lesson number 4 on investigating opioid misuse, dependency, and addiction. Till next time, my name is Barry Schmidt. I am the coordinator of the Bay County Prevention Network and project director of the Neighborhood Resource Center. I'd like to thank your teacher for the opportunity to show you this presentation today. Have a good day.